My name is Marcus Bowen, and I'm the Regional Head of Planning and Space Data Management in Asia Pacific for HSBC. And I suppose in plain English, that means I look after the money, which is about just over $1 billion US in expenditure for corporate real estate, and in space data management terms, which is really about who is where, what they're occupying, and effectively how we go on to bill them for their occupancy, which will make a lot of sense later on. Now, just before we get going, we'd only have 20 minutes. There aren't going to be lots of pretty pictures about offices in HSBC. That's not what this is about. We have three key areas to cover. The part one is really about talking about occupancy pre-COVID and some of the policy issues which came in, which sort of changed things. And then in part two, we're going to look into how the occupiers of all our space have more or less been, frankly, their way of thinking about space is changing, and it's changing quite profoundly. So that's a key area which we'd like to cover, and we'll get into some of the key topics in that area. And thirdly, I think we'll take this as a chance to reflect on lessons learned. More importantly, what are the realities of where we are right now? And we'll use a few slides at the end to just have a quick check-in on where we are on digital transformation in the banking sector, which frankly is a very exciting place to be right now from a corporate real estate point of view. Okay, so before we get into that, just very quickly, no big surprises. COVID in itself was not probably a surprise in terms of the type of pandemic that it is. Because if you look at this 2010 diagram, you can see that there's a whole backstory of human adapted influenza, which has been going on in Asia and particularly in Hong Kong. And so nearly everybody has had some near experience of it. And this is interesting because up to 2010, the question mark was, well, what's going to happen next? And, you know, there were some big questions. And you can see even in 1968, Hong Kong people wearing face masks. Wearing face masks has always been popular in Hong Kong for these types of reasons. You didn't need COVID, you just needed a bad cough. So what did happen? Well, what happened was SARS. Literally 2 years later, we got SARS. SARS, terrible. Within 3 months, WHO was issuing a global alert. But the truth of SARS is that, as you can see from this graph, frankly, terrible though it was all over in 6 months. And that sort of thinking really confused people, because if you look at this quotation from this blog of January 22nd of this year, this was advice from a Chinese blog poster about who knows about this stuff, saying, hey, I've heard something's going on in Wuhan. You need to remind yourself of how bad this can be. It can be as bad as SARS. How wrong he was. It's a lot worse, as we know. So this has been actually not a surprise, but also a very big surprise for people in the Asia region, and particularly in Hong Kong. Okay, so quickly, most people think Hong Kong is full of alleyways and wet markets and all sorts of, but actually the truth of it is most people live in places like this. And this is Apley Chow. Apley Chow on the south side of Hong Kong. It's the second most densely populated island in the world. And it's actually sparkling clean and really well managed. And I know because I live there in that block. And I don't have any problems with living in Apley Chow per se, but the thing you need to remember is that each one of those apartments quite potentially has 3 generations of people in it. And that significantly raises the stakes if somebody gets COVID. Okay, so we're not going to get into a timeline of COVID per se, but just to wrap up, February 2020, I was outside Hong Kong and I was flying back in, and by the time I got back to Hong Kong, it was deserted. People didn't need government agencies to tell them, stay at home, isolate, etc. This is a picture of Hong Kong's arrival terminal, which I reassure you, if you've ever been to Hong Kong, you'll know it does not look like this. There was nobody there. Astonishing. They'd all left and nobody was going to the airport, that was for sure. I did the same thing in September last month, came back, And this time you get tagged. This is an electronic device. It pretty well calls you up GPS every 3 or 4 hours and says, are you where we think you are? And there's quite a big difference in technology terms. We don't have time to get into all that, but it sort of sets the scene. And the mindset is how scary it is when you're in these highly densely populated areas. Okay, so what does this mean from an occupancy point of view? Well, we knew our baseline in HSBC was not great occupancy, to be honest. We weren't as bad or better, but never very good. And we actually had already something called open work. Now, open work was a strategic initiative. Some of you are probably pretty familiar with the type of thing, agile working and all that type of stuff. And it had 3 transformative layers. And notice that behavior is the first one. We had to change behaviors, technology, the physical environment, fitting out, etc., came later. Now, if you were in workplace up until COVID, most of the time you were going into doing open work presentations and people were sort of like this, and actually it was sometimes lucky that they turned up. It was a bit of an empty audience. And I think the biggest transformation for us is that we've gone from, frankly, not a lot of people turning up to everybody turning up. And in fact, now we're actually having them knock on the door and say, okay, when are you doing this for us? And some of you might find that familiar and very strange, having done workplace for so many years and some decades in your case, and then suddenly finding everybody wants a piece of you. But hey, that's where we are. Fantastic news. You can't do this type of workplace, however, without operational intelligence, data-driven decision-making. And particularly, remember, it's a bank, so they're very interested in data around all their decisions. And we have person IDs, and we have MAC addresses, familiar stuff. And we actually have an incredibly sophisticated setup of Ethernet and Wi-Fi, we call DU Prime. Remote working, we have VPN access data, and we have building access data. So we can actually, although we don't spot it at an individual name level because of privacy, but we can more or less monitor exact levels of occupancy, when and where, etc. And that gives us a fantastic insight into how buildings are being used and how things have changed over the COVID period. We have other sources of data, but I think, to be honest, things like workplace settings, sensors data is really an answer to other types of questions. What are they doing, how they were collaboratively working? So not less relevant for us, but what it does do is it provides fantastic dashboard intel, which we can share and democratize. And whilst my only criticism is that by and large it's past, we would like very much to move towards future trending and that type of analysis. And I think that's where we're going with this. So moving along. Oh, and I've crossed out mobile data because one of the key things about all this is privacy. And we'll touch on that at the end. So part 2, business occupiers changing thinking. Well, they'd already started profoundly rethinking the pressure of change on these businesses. And HSBC is made up of a whole number of businesses, as we'll see in a moment. But the pressure on change was already immense. We didn't need COVID. We had banking 4.0, which we'll touch on later on. We had changing work styles, which you all know and love. And we had the inexorable, we want to do more for less money push. And these themselves were pretty forceful anyway. And then along came COVID and literally weaponized the entire subject area of how do we manage with this amount of pressure. Very interesting. So what's happening now is that there is a huge shakeout between the occupier groups, the work styles that we know because we have all the analytics around it, and IT, who we collaborate with, who have all these types of personas for different types of kit, etc. Really amazingly complex, but being figured out now, and a lot of business engagement going on with CRE. So CRE people becoming much more engaged with businesses. So new ways of working, which is this term I know we customarily use, really for us is a sort of mix-up of the business, the group policy around how we're going to operate in this new post-COVIDian world, and CRE sensibilities. And it's a sort of triangle like this. We don't have time to get into it too much, but at the heart of it, from the top, I suppose, is desk sharing ratios. And that's the guiding thing that they sort of stick to at the top, and then it becomes more and more meaningful in real terms as we go into country, into buildings, into real people's lives. And the enablers obviously are rules, open work, we've talked about enhancing FM services, which we're going to touch on. Social distancing is very important, building limitations. In fact, we probably with social distancing won't actually change the space too much, even though we use it less because just we use it less densely. Interesting areas to be in, but a key areas we'll come back to is these COOs and space policy and who actually looks after that area. Now, HSBC is a really, really, really big business, and global has to inform region, has to inform country. It's a sort of layer cake of communications. So we start at high level at group, and it's a terms of reference, and then we move into region, and all the time we're cascading down until really you get me in region with my colleagues, and we're looking at new ways of working principles and pushing them into country. And that's really interesting because of the cultural differences within Asia. Asia is definitely not homogeneous. There are profoundly different ways of coming at work in different parts of Asia. We've got to pause for a moment just quickly and say, in CRE, there are something called metrics that matter. And if you really stop pre-COVID, these were the sorts of things which mattered. Keep the place safe, make the building available, stick to the budgets, recover all your costs from the business. Simple world. To a point, at a $1 billion US operation, it can get interesting with 19 countries, so many legal entities. But what we've discovered is that to really deliver on the new ways of working, we're going to have to develop workplace charters. Now, that is really a hugely interesting area and something which completely makes sense in a business like ours. So what are workplace charters? Well, they define the key workplace operating principles, essentially. In effect, they set out the protocols which are necessary to operate new ways of working. They're like an instruction manual, so to speak. But the key thing about them is that they cover all these subjects. Now, we don't have the time to get into each one of those subjects in detail. But what we can point out, you can see immediately, is some of them are economic, some of them are about effectively controlling people, some are of legal, and others are quite soft and touchy-feely. So there's a template for that. That's being worked on now, hugely interesting, bringing lots of people from outside CRE as well. I want to touch on one thing about the changing environment, and it's about recharges. We have a little rule, which is that we have to recover all our costs from all our businesses. We can't make a loss in corporate real estate. It's sort of not going to happen. So this is an area that I want to focus on, recovering all direct costs from the occupiers. Now, I'm going to talk about something that we have to sort of step back for a moment and say, okay, field, hotel, taxi. This is sort of how I describe what's going on. To some of you, you'll get it immediately. To others, I know, happy to deal with this in questions and answers later on. But essentially, a bad drawing, Marcus, but it's a field, it's a building. In the past, what we would do is we just say, there you go, do what you like. Go into the field, put up your tents, anything, but we'll charge you for the total cost of that field. And that's how we got our money back. Easy, transparent, no problem. However, over the years, increasingly, the buildings have been co-occupied, and some of them obviously 10, 12, 24 different types of occupier, all with their own P&Ls. And in hotel, it's what we call hotel, it's a more complex baby. And we recharge for using basically the red box, what space you actually occupy, the pink stuff, the floor shared, the green stuff, building shared. And it's a complicated mixture. Now, that wouldn't matter so much, was it not for the fact that in the reds are shrinking because people don't need so much space, but they want more collaboration, which is the pink stuff, and they're sharing that. So the system that we had for recharging all this space is becoming quite complicated and really difficult. Also, remember that these businesses themselves only really want to pay for when they're actually occupying, because quite a lot of the time their people aren't there. So that means, in a way, the recharging system is moving more to a taxi, where basically we say, you get in a taxi, you go for a ride, you get out, you pay a fare, that's the end of it. And at the moment, about 60% of our occupancy is probably field, 40% of it is probably hotel. And we're just starting to see occupiers putting a lot of pressure to try and create a world which is much more taxi. And taxi really, in another language, is space as a service. And that's a big jump now for us. Now, we haven't got the time to get into space as a service, so I've borrowed a quotation from Anthony Slumbers here. Thank you, Anthony, which succinctly describes it. But that is sort of how this business is moving, and they want to consume space. There is actually a bit of a misunderstanding with corporate real estate and workplace people, as they think that corporate occupiers actually like them and enjoy what they do. If they could live without corporate real estate and not have to pay for it, they would. So taxi is very attractive to them. Part 3. So what have we learned? I know we've gone very quickly through this, but what have we learned from this, and what are our thoughts for the future? Well, let's talk about the realities. The realities right now is that we clearly are competition. It's this whole ability to withstand a pandemic is a source of competitive advantage. We haven't stopped trading. In fact, ironically, we prepared for this pandemic in November last year. We had the whole of the corporate real estate group together in a region, actually in one room, hasn't happened again, right? Actually going through the sequencing and all the systems we had to do if we had a pandemic. It's already been prepared for. Business-led, we like to think that we obviously have the know-how, but the truth is the decisions have to come from the business, and that has to create a different relationship with us in consultative terms. Workplace, know your customer. I think it's fair to say that workplace people are starting to become more and more embedded in the businesses to really understand who they are. And we do actually have some corporate real estate people who actually have now gone to work inside businesses and are not on our payroll anymore, but they're still doing the same job. Interesting. Workplace skill sets, yeah, much more data. You can have become much more data savvy, whole new conversation there. Role of the office and the design, what actually goes in the office, it's a big part of the conversation right now, and less space. Do we need less space in absolute terms? We'll see. I think it hasn't completely played out. But there are two problems with this. Just moving on quickly, beware of work from home asymmetries. You probably all know that. You know, people who do enjoy working from home probably might not be the right people, and people who really like working in the office all the time actually need to work back home, and we need to work out how to facilitate that. And existence of false evidence, of course, we're basing our planning on COVID lifestyles, which actually may not be the real lifestyles at all. Wrong data, false evidence. So next steps, essentially called out around governance, getting this workplace charter into place. Not getting into the detail, we've already covered that. Operational intelligence, much wider use of operational intelligence, democratize that, let people get comfortable with the data that they're reading, etc., and getting much more predictive in how we do things, trending, etc. Cost management sort of talks for itself. And this key area around social, people and social, I mean, team dynamics and sustaining organizational culture is, yeah, I think that's probably should have been at the top of the list. It's going to become a big issue going forward. So, quickly, just to wind up, Industry 4.0, I've put in this slide just as a quick check so we all know what we're talking about. How does that affect banking? Well, HSBC are already obviously very well developed in this area. There's a lot of thinking around how banking 4.0 is going to be executed in HSBC. We're in no way are we lagging behind. But the truth is that even in Hong Kong, there's like 8 virtual banking licenses being given by the Hong Kong government. They're all competition trying to take our lunch off the table and eat it for themselves. And here's a current list. I checked out this list as of August. They're all operational now as far as I can make out. quite scary. But of course, HSBC has its own solutions and has no intention of giving up on some of the physical presence, but will be combining in this hybrid way, which is great to see. And I'm a big user and I'm a big fan of PayMe as well. So no problems there. Okay, so there's lastly, just to wind up, I have been in meetings now where we've talked about silver linings. There are some silver linings, and the silver linings for me are the fact that we're really on a pathway to answering the 5 big questions around effectively financial services and the use of the office post-COVID. First one is the role of the branch. Do we need a branch? I think that conversation is really well developed, and we're getting there, including design. The role of the office. Why do we come to the office? All those conversations. Very, very vibrant conversations going around there. Data governance, particularly this area of privacy and cybersecurity, as we acquire more and more data about how people use our space and what they're doing and how they're paying for it. We have to be incredibly careful with that data. 4, war for talent. I mean, let's be honest. At the end of the day, why are we in workplace? We're in workplace to make really fantastic places for people to do what they do. And that is really akin to war for talent, attracting people, keeping them, making them productive, making them master their jobs, enjoy the collaboration, all that sort of stuff. And 5th, culture. The question, how can the physical workplace actually bring that whole cultural piece together in a hybrid world? There's probably some other 6 a question, but frankly, if we can nail those 5, I'll be delighted. So on that note, I think we've run out of time. I would like to say thank you very much from Hong Kong.
Yeah, we've got about 60 people in the room, Marcus. Thank you very much for an excellent session. The cultural discussion is huge, I think. Having visited Hong Kong, I'm very aware that even my colleagues mentioned if you sneeze, someone's likely to bring you a tissue and even a mask, before COVID. So it's the cultural thing's really difficult. I'm going to bring Jason in, who's got a question for you. So Jason, if you can make sure that your audio is working okay. Jason, over to you. Question for Marcus. Thank you.
Oh, hi Marcus, how are you?
I'm living the dream.
I can imagine you are.
I can't tell you what type of dream it is, but
I'm a New Zealander calling you from Oxford. So I'm very interested in what you're doing in Asia Pacific, specifically down in New Zealand, where things are quite a bit different down there.
Oh yeah. Well, look. If you refer back to the earlier legal piece, just before my piece, you'll know that the way businesses like HSBC react to this does work in a legal framework, okay? So, they have to respond more or less in line with what the government want them to do. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So being real about it, New Zealand for us is, at a corporate level, treated no differently, okay? And it has to follow the local governance and the local rules and regulations and all that type of stuff, because whilst we work internationally, the rules are always going to be set locally or overridden by the local law, whichever is the higher standard. We don't have a big presence in New Zealand, so, but did that answer the question? Possibly not.
More or less it has, yeah.
What do you do? Tell me what you do.
Well, we're involved. I'm from a company called 14 Consulting, and we're primarily involved in culture and well-being, with the main focus being diversity and inclusion.
Okay,
well, that's within the workplace.
Yeah, so I've been watching the chat and about different cultures in Asia, and as you know, because you're in my cabbage patch, right, New Zealand, but I got Japan right at the other end. And when I first came to this part of the world, I should have been given that book, Kiss, Shake or Bow, which basically explains to people like me how profoundly different every country is in how they interpret. And what was interesting in the presentation I just gave, there is something called Workplace Charter in that. And what is really interesting me personally as a practitioner is how we're going to, and it's a word I suppose you might have heard of, glocalize, how we're going to take something like that and make it real for somebody in Jakarta.
Yes.
Or somebody, in Tokyo, and how that plays out, and which parts of those charters are absolutely red lines.
Yeah. And
which parts of them we go, yeah, okay, that's the local way of coming out. It's going to be fascinating, totally fascinating.
Yeah, and also it's tying that back into where we are now, which is the UK, which is high up the agenda for everyone here, in a big way, I think.
I'd love to visit the UK, but I'd have to do another. And if I went to the UK now, I'd have to spend 14 days in a government hotel. Am I being diplomatic?
Yes, absolutely. Jason, thanks very much for that. I brought someone else into the room. Rosie?
Hi,
I'm sure you've got another great question for Marcus. Over to you.
Thank you. Hi, Marcus. I'm just picking up on a conversation that Tim Oldman and I were having earlier on about retail banking. So I'm quite interested in the community and kind of people, coming together. I'm based in London, based in the UK. So kind of bringing people together when they can't necessarily travel to a city, perhaps. And Tim had mentioned about retail banking, kind of banks bringing people together. And I was just thinking, from banks educating people about financial elements, are you working on that? Are you seeing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, oh man, it's like jumping off on a whole big subject. So you're going to get a very skinny version for me. Pre-COVID, and talk for HSBC, okay? Just facts. Pre-COVID, we had things like mobile branches, because there are people who are getting older. They can't necessarily get to a branch. And we actually have mobile branches which go out to the big housing estates, 3 times. And that was a solution, all right? Now, this device has greatly changed the landscape for that, because, the granddaughter is teaching grandma how to do it, right? The big question is, I suppose, at your heart of what you're saying is the role of the branch in the community. Is that what it went?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, and bringing people together rather than closing these spaces, actually kind of opening them or keeping them open and bringing the community together. Yes,
I absolutely. And I think I've got to be careful what I say, because obviously it changes from country to country, et cetera, But in Hong Kong, you've got to remember HSBC is on the banknotes. We issue the banknotes, right? So we're deeply embedded into society, and people's local branch is, if they lost that, there would be a big deal. But you've also got to remember a subsidiary of HSBC is Hang Seng, and Hang Seng is the more local Cantonese variant. But there are a lot of roles for businesses like HSBC levering that local community connection, which is more charitable and doesn't really rely on there being a branch there. We do a lot of other things in the community. Does that make sense? Yes, we don't see ourselves as turning the branch into some sort of other platform to do other things necessarily. We've already got other places to do that.
Thank you, Rosie.
So it's a big subject.
Thank you, Rosie. That's excellent. Marcus, thank you very much. It is now 12:30.